He could smell her fertility on the wind, a primal instinct that awakened something wild within him. The mountain man's whispered words sent chills down her spine, leaving the poor woman frozen between fear and an inexplicable attraction. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. Sometimes, when life corners you, you discover what you're truly made of. Mary Johnson found this out the hard way, on a bitter winter evening in the Colorado mountains. The biting wind cut through her threadbare coat as she trudged upward, each step sinking into snow that seemed determined to claim her. 3 weeks ago, she had been a respectable widow in Denver. Now, she was a fugitive from debt collectors with nothing but the clothes on her back and her father's pocket watch tucked safely in her skirt pocket. The abandoned mining camp at Crystal Creek was supposed to be her salvation, a place to hide until spring, when she might find work and rebuild what Daniel's death had stolen from her. Instead, as darkness fell and the temperature plummeted, Mary found herself hopelessly lost among towering pines and jagged cliffs that looked nothing like the crude map she'd purchased. When the small cabin appeared through the swirling snow, Mary nearly wept with relief. Its chimney puffed welcoming smoke into the twilight sky. Abandoned, she thought, a miracle. Her frozen fingers fumbled with the rough-hewn door, pushing it open to reveal blessed warmth from a crackling hearth. The widow collapsed beside the fire, extending her numb hands toward the flames. Only then did she notice the cabin's sparse but deliberate furnishings: a wooden chair crafted by hand, dried herbs hanging from ceiling beams, and a bed of furs in the corner. Someone lived here. But surely they would understand her desperate circumstances. Mary had just begun to regain feeling in her toes when the door swung open. A blast of cold air announced the arrival of a mountain of a man, his broad shoulders dusted with snow, dark hair streaked with silver falling wild past his shoulders. Samuel Brown filled the doorway completely, his weathered face a mask of surprise and suspicion as he regarded the intruder by his fire. "I'm so sorry," she stammered, struggling to her feet. "I thought this place was abandoned. I'll leave immediately." But even as the words left her mouth, Mary knew venturing back into the night would mean certain death. The mountain man studied her with eyes accustomed to reading both wilderness and men. He took in her city clothes, now tattered and soaked, the hollow cheeks that spoke of hunger, the wedding band, twisted and damaged, still clinging to her finger. "You'll die before you reach the tree line," he stated flatly, closing the door against the howling wind. His voice was rough from disuse, as if he'd spoken to more animals than people in recent years. When he found her shivering by his fire, his next words shattered her last illusions about safety in this wild place. "I can smell your fertile," Samuel Brown's gruff voice rumbled across the cabin, a statement as wild as the land itself. The words hung in the air between them, primal and unfiltered by the niceties of civilization. Mary's heart stuttered in her chest. Her back pressed hard against the rough-hewn log wall as she clutched her tattered coat tighter around her trembling frame. The mountain man's declaration stripped away any pretense that this encounter would follow the polite rules she'd known in Denver. That's not proper talk," she managed to whisper, though the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. What did propriety matter now, when she was trespassing in a stranger's home, miles from anything familiar? Samuel's weathered face remained impassive, his eyes reflecting the dancing flames from the stone hearth. "Proper doesn't survive up here," he said simply. "The mountain doesn't care about your city manners." The firelight flickered across Mary's torn gold wedding band, catching the dull gleam of metal that had once shone bright with promise. Just weeks before, it had been a symbol of security and respectability. Now, it felt like a shackle, weighing her down with shame and loss, a constant reminder of Daniel's betrayal and the debt he'd left in his wake. "I should go," Mary said, though they both knew she had nowhere to go. Outside, the wind howled through the pines, carrying the threat of snow and certain death for anyone foolish enough to wander the mountain unprepared. Samuel moved toward the fire, adding another log with practiced efficiency. "You've got two choices," he said, his back to her. "Return to whatever's hunting you down there," he nodded toward the valley below, "or stay here and learn to live by different rules." Mary watched his movements, calculating her options with the desperate clarity of someone who'd already lost everything. The widow studied his broad shoulders and the confident way he handled the burning wood. There was nothing refined about him, nothing that reminded her of the smooth-talking men she'd known in the city. Yet there was something honest in his bluntness that Daniel had never possessed. "And what would those rules be?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. Samuel turned to face her, the firelight casting deep shadows across his features. "Truth, work, survival." He paused, then added, "and respect for the mountain and each other." Mary's fingers twisted around her wedding band, that small circle of broken promises. She could either return to a world determined to break her, or trust her fate to this untamed stranger who spoke of fertility as casually as city folk discussed the weather. The choice before her wasn't just about shelter for the night. It was about who she might become if she dared to stay. 3 weeks ago, Mary Johnson had still believed in a future. The modest home she'd kept in Denver had been filled with small treasures. Embroidered pillows her mother had taught her to make, a china teapot that had been her grandmother's, and the dreams she'd carefully tended since girlhood. She'd been Mrs. Daniel Johnson for barely 6 months, still learning the rhythms of marriage when the first knock came at their door. The creditors arrived like vultures, one after another, men in stiff suits with cold eyes who spoke of promissory notes and outstanding balances in amounts that made her dizzy. Mary had stood frozen as they inventoried her possessions, assigning paltry values to items that held her heart. Daniel had assured her it was all a misunderstanding, his smile as charming as the day they'd met. But his eyes had darted away when she pressed for answers. "My investments just need time to mature," he'd insisted, squeezing her hand. "These city businessmen have no patience." But patience wouldn't stop the seizure of their home. Mary had watched helplessly as Daniel's debts swallowed everything she'd built. Furniture carried out piece by piece, her mother's silver sold for a fraction of its worth. Even her wedding china, still new enough that some pieces remained unwrapped, disappeared into strangers' hands. The consumption had taken Daniel swiftly after that. Perhaps it was the shame that weakened him, or perhaps the disease had been lurking all along, waiting for vulnerability. Mary had nursed him through 6 weeks of bloody handkerchiefs and rattling breaths, selling her remaining jewelry piece by piece to pay for medicines that did nothing. "I'm sorry," he'd whispered near the end, his once handsome face gaunt and gray. "I only wanted to give you everything." Instead, his legacy was 3 lifetimes of debt and a widow's bitter tears. After the modest funeral, paid for by her last gold earrings, the landlord had given her 3 days to vacate. Mary had stood in the empty rooms that had briefly been her home, clutching her father's pocket watch and her mother's recipe book, the only treasures the creditors had overlooked. With nowhere else to turn, she'd headed west toward the mining camp, where Daniel had once mentioned connections. The journey had depleted her last coins, leaving her with nothing but the clothes on her back and the crushing weight of a future that had evaporated like morning mist on the mountainside. Samuel Brown stood by the stone hearth he built with his own hands years ago, every muscle in his body taut with the patience of a man who'd learned to trust only himself in the wilderness. The firelight cast dancing shadows across his weathered face, highlighting the sharp angles time and solitude had carved into his features. His dark hair, streaked with silver like the night sky touched by starlight, fell wild to his shoulders, untamed as the mountains themselves. The clothes that covered his sturdy frame had been worn soft by 15 years of isolation, patched and mended countless times with the practical skill of someone who had no use for appearances. Mary Johnson watched him from across the cabin, her breath shallow in her chest. The widow clutched her tattered coat tighter, as if the thin fabric could somehow shield her from the intensity of his gaze. She tried to swallow, but her throat felt parched, constricted by fear and uncertainty. In Denver, she'd been taught how to behave in drawing rooms, how to make pleasant conversation over tea, how to hide her true feelings behind a veil of propriety and good manners. But this wasn't Denver. The rules of society meant nothing beneath these towering peaks. The cabin walls, built from rough-hewn logs, seemed to close in around her, reminding Mary how far she'd traveled from everything familiar. The mountain didn't care about her upbringing or what Daniel's mother would think of her current predicament. Here, survival demanded a different kind of honesty, raw and unfiltered. She started, then faltered. What could she possibly say that wouldn't sound ridiculous? That she'd fled her husband's debts with nothing but the clothes on her back and a desperate hope? That she'd thought an abandoned mining camp might somehow offer salvation? The mountain man shifted his weight, his movements deliberate and economical. Nothing wasted, nothing for show. He didn't rush to fill the silence between them, comfortable with the quiet in a way that spoke of years spent with only the wind and wildlife for company. Mary's fingers found the torn gold wedding band, twisting it nervously. The metal caught the firelight, a dull gleam that seemed to mock her former life. She'd once believed this ring symbolized security and belonging. Now it was merely a reminder of all she'd lost. "I should explain myself," she finally managed, her voice barely audible above the crackling fire. The words felt inadequate against the vastness of her circumstances, but they were all she had to offer. "I got lost," she finally managed, barely above a whisper. The words felt inadequate against the weight of her circumstances. Mary Johnson's fingers twisted nervously at the frayed edges of her coat, a garment never intended for mountain winters. "I was trying to reach the mining camp at Crystal Creek, but the storm—" Samuel cut her off with a gentleness that surprised her, given his rough exterior. "That camp's been abandoned for years. Nothing left but ghosts and empty holes." His revelation hit her like a physical blow. The mining camp had been her last hope, a desperate gamble based on rumors of work for anyone willing, even women. Mary swallowed hard, fighting back the sting of tears that threatened to spill. She had traveled so far on nothing but this fragile thread of possibility. Samuel Brown studied her from across the cabin, his weathered face illuminated by the dancing firelight. His eyes, sharp and assessing, read her story in every hollow of her cheeks and every desperate line of her shoulders. The mountain man moved with deliberate care, as though afraid she might bolt like a frightened deer. "You running from something or to something?" The question lingered, heavier than the mountain snow piling outside the cabin walls. Mary's gaze dropped to the rough-hewn floorboards. Daniel's debts, his mother's cruel words about barren wives, the humiliation of watching everything auctioned away. It all pressed down upon her like a physical weight. The collectors in Denver wouldn't stop until they'd extracted every last penny, even if it meant working her fingers to bone in a factory or worse. Both, perhaps, she admitted, surprising herself with her candor. Something about this place, this man, made pretense seem pointless. "I had nothing left in the city." Samuel nodded slowly, as if confirming something he'd already suspected. He added another log to the fire, and sparks spiraled upward through the stone chimney. The cabin smelled of pine, smoke, and something earthy that Mary couldn't name. So different from the coal smoke and sewage stench of Denver. "The mountain doesn't care what you were before," he said finally. "Only what you are now, what you become." His words carried the weight of personal experience. Outside, the wind howled with renewed fury, rattling the shutters Samuel had secured earlier. The storm was intensifying, sealing them together in this moment of truth. Mary realized with sudden clarity that her carefully constructed plans, already threadbare, had completely unraveled. "And what am I now?" she asked, her voice stronger than before. "A survivor," Samuel replied simply. "Or you wouldn't have made it this far." She admitted, fingers twisting her broken ring. The gold band caught the firelight, its torn edge a testament to the desperate measures she'd taken to survive. Mary Johnson's shoulders slumped with the weight of her confession. Samuel Brown nodded as if he'd known all along, his weathered face revealing no judgment. He had recognized the look of someone fleeing the moment she stumbled into his cabin. He'd worn that same expression 15 years ago when he first climbed these mountains. "Most folks who find themselves this deep in the wilderness are running from something," he said, his voice low and steady. "The mountains don't ask questions." He moved with the fluid grace of a man accustomed to conserving energy, each motion purposeful as he added another log to the crackling fire. Sparks danced upward, illuminating the rough-hewn walls of the cabin he'd built with his own hands. The mountain man gestured to a hand-carved wooden stool near the hearth. "Sit. Warm yourself properly." Mary hesitated, her city upbringing warring with her current reality. Her mother had drilled propriety into her since childhood. Never accept charity. Maintain dignity even in hardship. A lady never imposes. But those lessons seemed hollow now, meaningless against the hunger that twisted her insides and the bone-deep cold that had settled into her limbs during her desperate journey from Denver. The cabin smelled of pine, smoke, and something rich simmering in the cast-iron pot hanging above the flames. Her stomach growled audibly, betraying her need. I shouldn't impose," she whispered, though her body swayed toward the promise of warmth and nourishment. Samuel's eyes, clear and direct as the mountain streams, met hers. "Up here, pride is a luxury that kills faster than the cold." He stirred the contents of the pot with a wooden spoon, worn smooth from years of use. Steam rose, carrying the scent of venison and wild herbs that made Mary's mouth water involuntarily. "Denver's rules don't reach this high," he continued, ladling stew into a wooden bowl. "Mountain has its own law. First one being, you don't let someone starve when you've got food to share." The bowl he offered was rough-carved but clean, the stew inside thick and hearty. Mary's hands trembled as she finally accepted it, her fingers brushing against his calloused ones in the exchange. "Thank you," she murmured, the warmth of the bowl seeping into her frozen hands. She took a tentative spoonful, then another, propriety forgotten as the first real food she'd had in days filled her empty stomach. The widow closed her eyes briefly, savoring the simple meal as if it were the finest dining in Colorado. Samuel watched her quietly, adding another log to the fire. The meal was simple but hearty. Mary Johnson cupped the wooden bowl in her trembling hands, savoring the warmth that seeped through her cold fingers. The venison stew was unlike anything she'd eaten in Denver, gamey and wild, with chunks of meat swimming alongside foraged onions and unfamiliar roots that had a sweet, earthy flavor. Her stomach growled audibly, reminding her that she hadn't eaten properly in days. "Thank you," she murmured, carefully spooning the broth into her mouth. Though starvation clawed at her insides, she fought against the urge to devour it like a wild animal. The remnants of her city upbringing still clung to her, even here, miles from civilization. Samuel nodded silently, his weathered face illuminated by the dancing firelight. He ate methodically, with the practiced efficiency of a man who viewed food as fuel rather than pleasure. His dark hair, streaked with silver, fell across his face as he bent over his own bowl. "Mountain's got its own rules," he finally said, breaking the silence that had settled between them. His voice was deep and rustic, like stones rolling down a hillside. "First, you don't let anyone starve." Second, everything has a cost. Mary's spoon paused halfway to her mouth. The steam from the stew rose between them like a question. She lowered the utensil slowly, her appetite suddenly tempered by wariness. "What kind of cost?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the crackling of the fire. Samuel's eyes met hers across the small table he'd fashioned from a split log. They were clear and direct, holding none of the veiled intentions she'd grown accustomed to in her late husband's gaze. "Honesty, mostly," he said, his expression unblinking. "Up here, lies can kill faster than cold. City folk bring their secrets and their shame, thinking the mountains will hide them." He set his empty bowl aside. "But the mountains don't care about your past. They only care if you're smart enough to survive the present." Mary's fingers tightened around her father's pocket watch in her dress pocket, the last valuable thing she owned. She wondered if Samuel could somehow sense it, if he expected payment beyond just honesty. "I don't have much to offer," she admitted, the words bitter on her tongue. "Didn't ask for anything," Samuel replied, rising to add another log to the fire. "Just telling you how things work up here." The flames leapt higher, casting his shadow large against the cabin wall. "Finish your food. Night's getting colder." Mary nodded and returned to her meal, wondering what other rules this mountain had that she would need to learn to survive. Samuel Brown studied Mary across the flames, his weathered face illuminated by the dancing firelight. There was something in his gaze that made her feel transparent, as if the layers of propriety she'd wrapped around herself had suddenly turned to glass. "You're not just running from debt," he said quietly. "There's fear in you that goes deeper." His words struck with uncanny precision. Mary's chest tightened as unwelcome memories surfaced. Daniel's face twisting with disappointment, month after month. His mother's venomous whispers about barren wives being worse than no wife at all. The humiliation of standing before the doctor in Denver as he clinically explained her womanly failings to her husband, as if she weren't even present. "It's not proper to speak of such things," she whispered, fingers unconsciously twisting the torn gold band on her finger. The firelight caught the dull metal, a reminder of promises that had withered long before consumption claimed her husband. Samuel added another log to the fire, sparks spiraling upward like fleeing spirits. "Proper's for people who don't have to survive the winter," he replied, his voice neither judgmental nor pitying. "Up here, truth keeps you alive. The mountain doesn't care about your city manners or what secrets you're hiding." He settled back, his movements economical and sure. "And your body's telling me you're stronger than you think." Mary felt heat rise to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the hearth. In Denver, no man would dare speak so directly to a lady, yet there was something liberating in his bluntness. The mountain man didn't dance around difficult truths or coat them in polite fictions. "My husband," she began, then faltered. "Daniel believed I failed him. His mother said it was God's judgment." Samuel's expression hardened. "Men like to blame women for what nature decides," he said. "Seen it even in the wild. The weak always need someone weaker to blame." The wooden cross above the mantel caught Mary's eye. She wondered if Samuel prayed to the same God who had supposedly judged her wanting. "The animals don't waste time on blame," he continued, following her gaze to the cross. "They just survive, adapt, find new paths when old ones close." Mary found herself nodding, something unfamiliar and warm unfolding in her chest. Not hope exactly, but perhaps its wilder cousin. "And what does your mountain wisdom say about me?" she asked, surprising herself with her boldness. Samuel's eyes met hers across the flames. "That you've been measured by the wrong standards for too long." Mary Johnson's cheeks burned with embarrassment, yet she found an unexpected comfort in Samuel's directness. No one had ever spoken to her with such raw honesty before. In Denver, conversations were veiled in propriety and hidden meanings, especially when discussing matters of the body or heart. But here, miles from civilization, Samuel Brown's bluntness felt like a strange kind of respect. "You don't need to be ashamed," he said, soaking the fire. The flames highlighted the silver streaks in his dark hair. The mountain doesn't care about society's rules. Mary wrapped her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders. Throughout her marriage to Daniel, she'd been constantly measured by what she could provide: a proper home, children, social standing. When consumption took her husband, his mother had barely waited until the funeral to remind Mary of her failures. 6 months, and not even a child to show for it, the older woman had hissed. Yet here, in this rough-hewn cabin, Samuel valued something entirely different. He saw strength in her desperation, potential in her determination to survive. "I can teach you everything you need to know," he continued, his voice low and steady as he placed another log on the fire. "How to hunt when game is scarce, how to read the clouds before a storm comes, how to defend yourself against man or beast." His calloused hands moved with practiced efficiency. "All I ask in return is companionship and honesty." Mary studied him carefully. In the city, such an offer from a man would have only one implication. But Samuel's eyes held no deception, only the clear gaze of someone who had lived too long with only the truth for company. "And what exactly does companionship mean to you?" she asked, finding courage in his frankness. Samuel sat back on his heels. "Conversation, someone to share meals with, a voice besides my own." He paused, meeting her gaze directly. "I won't lie and say I don't find you attractive, but I'm not offering protection in exchange for your bed." The proposition hung in the air between them, both terrifying and tempting. Mary twisted her torn wedding band, thinking of the debts waiting in Denver, the accusations, the shame. Here was a chance to become someone new, someone who could survive on her own terms. "I need to think about it," she whispered. Samuel nodded, respecting her hesitation. "The mountain teaches patience. Take the time you need." He stood, his tall frame casting long shadows across the cabin walls. "But remember, winter won't wait for your decision." Mary Johnson sat by the crackling fire, her thin fingers tracing the frayed edges of her coat. The choice before her seemed impossible. Return to Denver and face debtor's prison, or remain here in this rustic cabin with a stranger who spoke truths no city man would dare utter. "I need time to think," she whispered, her voice catching on the words like fabric on a nail. Samuel nodded, his weathered hands methodically stoking the fire. Sparks danced upward as he arranged the logs with practiced precision. "Take it," he replied, his tone neither pressing nor dismissive. "But the mountain waits for no one. Decisions here can't linger like they do in town." The widow watched him work, studying the way the firelight caught in the silver streaks of his dark hair. There was something comforting in his movements. No wasted motion, no pretense. Unlike Daniel, whose charm had masked a hollow core, this mountain man's roughness concealed something genuine. As night deepened around the cabin, Mary made a bed of blankets near the hearth. Samuel retreated to his corner without comment, respecting the invisible boundary between them. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It felt honest, like everything else in this place. Sleep eluded her. The wooden cross mounted above the mantel caught her attention, its simple lines a stark contrast to the ornate crucifixes in Denver's churches. Had someone carved it for comfort or protection? Mary wondered if faith meant something different up here, where God's presence felt both closer and more terrible in the vast wilderness. Her gold wedding band glinted dully in the dying firelight. 6 months of marriage had brought nothing but grief and obligation. Daniel's mother had made it clear what a wife's duty was: to bear children, to maintain a proper home. Mary had failed at both, according to the older woman's sharp tongue. Yet Samuel had looked at her differently. Not as a failed wife or a debtor, but as someone with strength he recognized before she saw it herself. "You're stronger than you think," he'd said, and something in his certainty made her want to believe it. The mountain winds howled outside, a wild lullaby so different from Denver's street sounds. Mary's gaze returned to the wooden cross, and she found herself whispering a prayer she hadn't dared voice before, not for rescue, but for courage to forge something new from the ashes of her old life. Could she truly start again, learn to hunt, to survive, to live by different rules? The thought was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. As exhaustion finally claimed her, Mary's last conscious thought was that perhaps second chances didn't come as divine intervention, but in the form of impossible choices that forced you to become someone new. Mary Johnson woke to the gentle crackle of embers in the hearth. The cabin was silent except for the soft whisper of wind against the shutters. She pulled the rough woolen blanket tighter around her shoulders, savoring the warmth before facing the inevitable cold. When she finally gathered the courage to rise, Mary discovered a transformed world through the small window. The landscape had been reborn overnight. Pristine white snow blanketed everything, erasing all traces of yesterday's world. The sight was breathtaking and terrifying in equal measure. Samuel Brown was already at work outside, his powerful arms rising and falling in a steady rhythm as he split logs with practiced efficiency. Each stroke was deliberate, born from years of self-reliance. His breath formed clouds in the thin mountain air, dissipating like ghosts against the brilliant white backdrop. Mary wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and stepped outside, immediately regretting her decision. Her city boots, once considered fashionable in Denver streets, sank uselessly into the snow, allowing the cold to seep through immediately. The thin cotton dress and worn coat she'd fled with were pitiful defenses against the mountain's winter. "Morning," Samuel called without pausing his work. Sweat glistened on his brow despite the biting cold, his dark hair tied back with a leather cord. Mary nodded, teeth chattering too violently for proper speech. Pride kept her from retreating back inside, from admitting her complete unpreparedness for this life. She'd already accepted his food and shelter. Asking for clothing seemed a step too far. The mountain man glanced at her, taking in her inadequate attire with a practiced eye. "You should be going?" he asked, the question gentle despite its bluntness. "Going where?" Mary finally managed, her voice small against the vastness of white surrounding them. The admission cost her more than she expected, acknowledging aloud that she had nowhere left to go, no sanctuary beyond this stranger's cabin. Samuel drove his axe into the chopping block and straightened, studying her with those penetrating eyes that seemed to read every thought behind her carefully maintained composure. "There's spare furs inside the trunk," he said after a moment. The rhythmic thud of the axe followed Mary back into the cabin, a steady heartbeat in this strange new world she'd stumbled into. "Right, according to who?" Samuel challenged, his voice cutting through her doubts like the sharp mountain air. "The same society that let you walk into a mountain winter alone?" His words carried no malice, only the plain truth that hung between them in the cabin's warm air. Mary Johnson flinched, as if struck. The mountain man's question pierced deeper than the cold ever could. Who was she trying to impress out here? The proper society ladies of Denver, who had turned their backs when Daniel's debts became known? The church congregation that offered prayers but no shelter? "I was taught that a woman should," she began, then faltered. The rules that had governed her life seemed as distant as the city lights now, meaningless against the stark reality of survival. Samuel moved to stoke the fire, his movements efficient and practiced. "The mountain doesn't care what you were taught. Neither do the wolves or the winter." He glanced at her with those penetrating eyes that seemed to read her very thoughts. "Up here, there's only what keeps you alive and what kills you." Mary's fingers trembled as she reached into her coat pocket, pulling out her father's gold pocket watch. The timepiece caught the firelight, its polished surface reflecting tiny flames. This was her last connection to her former life, the final valuable thing she possessed. "I can pay my way," she said, extending her hand with the watch resting on her palm. "This was my father's. It's gold, worth something even out here." Samuel looked at the offering, then back at her face. The mountain man shook his head slowly, pushing her hand gently back toward her chest. "A person's timepiece isn't something to trade away lightly," he said, his voice softer now. "Especially not one that belonged to your kin." He returned to his chair, stretching his legs toward the hearth. "Pride's a sin if it keeps you from the help you need." Mary clutched the watch to her chest, unexpected tears pricking at her eyes. No one in Denver had shown such understanding, not the creditors, not her late husband's friends, not even the pastor who spoke of Christian charity. "I don't want charity," she whispered. "Good," Samuel replied, "because I'm not offering any. What I'm offering is a chance, same as the mountain offers. Fair exchange, your work for shelter, your company for knowledge." He paused, studying her face. "The choice is yours, but choose knowing that some pride is worth keeping, and some will just get you buried in snow." The cabin fell silent, except for the crackling fire and the distant howl of wind. Mary slipped the watch back into her pocket, feeling its weight, the burden and comfort of her past, against her heart. Samuel Brown stood at the cabin's threshold, his weathered face turned toward the darkening sky. The mountain had its own language, and after 15 years of solitude, he spoke it fluently. The sudden drop in temperature, the way the birds had gone silent, the peculiar heaviness in the air, these were warnings he'd learned to heed. "A bad one's coming," he muttered, his eyes tracking the ominous wall of clouds rolling over the distant peaks. "We need to prepare." The urgency in his voice was something Mary hadn't heard before, a tone that brooked no argument. Mary Johnson hesitated at the edge of the clearing, her thin city coat offering little protection against the already biting wind. She'd been gathering kindling, trying to make herself useful after 3 days of feeling like a burden. "How can you tell?" she asked, clutching her bundle of sticks tighter. Samuel didn't answer immediately, instead reaching for her arm and guiding her firmly toward the cabin. "The mountain's breathing differently. When she holds her breath like this, it means she's about to roar." His grip was gentle but insistent. "If you leave now, you'll die." Inside, the cabin transformed before Mary's eyes. What had seemed merely rustic now revealed itself as a fortress designed to withstand nature's fury. Samuel moved with practiced efficiency, securing shutters, checking the chimney draft, and positioning water buckets strategically around the room. "Is there something I can do to help?" Mary asked, feeling useless as she stood in the center of the single room, her city-bred hands soft and unprepared for this wild existence. The mountain man paused, assessing her with those penetrating eyes that seemed to see straight through pretense. "Stay warm and don't panic," he replied, the calmness in his voice a stark contrast to the wind that had begun to howl outside. "Fear kills faster than cold." He showed her how to wrap herself in layers of furs and blankets, then continued his preparations. Mary watched him work, struck by the deliberate nature of his movements. There was no wasted energy, no unnecessary gestures, just the calm efficiency of a man who'd outlasted many storms. "My husband would have been terrified," she found herself saying, the words escaping before she could catch them. "Daniel always hated thunder." Samuel glanced at her as he stacked extra firewood by the hearth. "The mountain doesn't care what we fear. She only respects preparation and respect." As darkness fell completely, the storm unleashed its full fury. The cabin creaked and groaned under the assault, but held firm, just like the man who'd built it with his own hands. Mary watched Samuel with quiet fascination as he moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency. Each action seemed choreographed by years of survival. The way he secured the shutters against the howling wind, checked the woodpile, and positioned buckets to catch any leaks from the roof. His hands, weathered and strong, worked with a certainty that made her own city-bred hesitation seem foolish. The storm unleashed its fury, rattling the small windows and sending occasional moans through the chimney. Wind found every crack in the cabin walls, creating eerie whistles that made Mary pull her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Yet inside, Samuel Brown had created a fortress of warmth and safety. "The worst storms can last days," he explained, stoking the fire higher. "This one's got the feel of a long one." Mary nodded, trying to hide her nervousness as the cabin creaked under a particularly strong gust. "Is there something I can do to help?" she asked, hating the feeling of uselessness that had followed her from Denver to this mountain refuge. "Stay warm, and don't panic," Samuel replied, his voice steady as the mountain beneath them. "Fear kills faster than cold up here." She watched him place extra candles within reach and check his water stores. There was something comforting in his movements, the calm of a man who had weathered countless storms, both of nature and of life. The howling outside seemed less threatening when framed by his confidence. As night deepened and the storm's rage intensified, Mary found herself drawing courage from his example. The wooden cross above the mantel caught the firelight, reminding her of prayers long forgotten. She touched her torn wedding band, thinking of all she'd lost, and perhaps what she might gain. "Tell me about this arrangement you mentioned," she finally said, her voice barely audible above the wind's screams. Samuel looked up from the fire, his dark eyes reflecting the flames. He studied her face for a long moment, as if measuring her readiness for truth. "I offer survival and honesty," he said simply. "I'll teach you everything I know about living with the mountain, not against it. In return, you help with the work, and we face the mountain together." The directness of his gaze made Mary's heart quicken. There was no pretense in his offer, no hidden clauses like the contracts that had ruined her life in Denver. Just the plain truth of two people against the wilderness. "Together," she repeated, testing the word. It had meant something different with Daniel. Obligation, disappointment, debt. Here in this cabin with the mountain's fury surrounding them, it seemed to promise something she'd never truly had. Partnership. "And the other part?" Mary pressed, her voice barely audible above the crackling fire. The flames cast dancing shadows across the cabin walls, illuminating the small space they now shared. Samuel Brown set down the knife he'd been sharpening and met her gaze directly. His answer was unflinching. "I'm attracted to you, but I'm not an animal. What happens between us will be our choice, together, not just nature's course." Mary's fingers instinctively found her torn wedding band. 6 months of marriage to Daniel had taught her that men's desires often came wrapped in pretty words, with little regard for her own feelings. Yet Samuel's bluntness carried no hidden agenda, no manipulation, just raw honesty that felt almost sacred in its simplicity. "I've known men who claimed to be gentlemen," she said carefully, "who behaved far worse than animals when doors were closed." The mountain man nodded, understanding etched in the weathered lines of his face. "The wilderness teaches you what matters. Pretending is a luxury for those with walls and neighbors. Up here, there's just truth." Outside, the wind howled through the pines, a reminder of the harsh world beyond their shelter. Mary studied the wooden cross hanging above the mantel, wondering if God had led her here for a reason. The life she'd known in Denver, the endless social expectations, the crushing weight of appearances, seemed like a distant dream now. "I don't know who I am anymore," she confessed. "The woman who left the city might as well be dead." "Good," Samuel replied, surprising her. "The mountain lets you shed what doesn't serve you, like a snake's old skin." Mary thought about the recipe book tucked in her bag, her mother's legacy of domestic perfection. How many hours had she spent trying to be the proper wife Daniel wanted? How many tears had she shed over her apparent failure to conceive the heir his family demanded? Here, in this cabin built by Samuel's own hands, none of that mattered. Here, her worth wasn't measured by her ability to produce children or maintain appearances. Here, she could simply be. The frankness should have shocked her, but Mary felt only relief washing over her like spring rain. For the first time since she could remember, she faced a choice that was truly hers to make, not dictated by family expectations or social convention. "All right," she said quietly, straightening her shoulders. "I'll stay." Samuel nodded once, respect evident in his eyes. He didn't move toward her or make any grand declarations. Instead, he simply returned to his knife, giving her the space to breathe in her decision. That night, as the storm raged outside, Mary slept more soundly than she had in years. For 3 days, the storm raged without mercy. Snow piled against the cabin walls, and the wind's howl became a constant companion that made conversation difficult. Mary Johnson and Samuel huddled near the hearth, rationing firewood with careful precision. The small wooden structure creaked and groaned under nature's assault, but held firm, much like the woman who now sat cross-legged on the floor, mending a torn shirt by firelight. "Will it always be this fierce?" Mary asked, her needle pausing mid-stitch as a particularly strong gust rattled the shutters. Samuel glanced up from where he was carving a wooden spoon, his hands never stopping their rhythmic movement. "Sometimes worse. The mountains don't make promises about being gentle." The forced confinement should have made Mary anxious. Instead, she found an unexpected peace in the simplicity of their existence. Eat, sleep, stay warm, survive. No creditors pounding at the door. No whispers about the widow Johnson and her husband's debts. Here, the mountain's judgment was pure and uncomplicated. On the second night, when the fire burned low, Samuel told her stories of his first winter alone. "Thought I'd die," he admitted, voice soft beneath the storm's rage. "But the mountain teaches you patience. Everything passes eventually." Mary found herself watching his hands as he spoke, strong, capable hands that had built this sanctuary board by board. They were nothing like Daniel's soft, manicured fingers that had signed away their future with careless flourishes. By the third day, they moved around each other with the ease of longtime companions. Samuel would reach for the kettle just as Mary set it aside. She would hand him kindling moments before he needed it. The wooden cross above the mantel caught the firelight, and Mary found herself offering silent prayers, not for rescue, but for wisdom. When a storm finally exhausted itself, silence fell so complete it woke Mary from a deep sleep. Samuel was already at the window, unlatching the shutters. When he threw them open, sunlight flooded the cabin with blinding intensity. "Come see," he said simply. Mary joined him, breath catching in her throat. The world outside was transformed. Pristine white stretched in every direction, trees bowed under crystalline weight, the sky an impossible blue. Everything felt renewed, purified. "It's beautiful," she whispered, her hand unconsciously finding his arm. Samuel nodded, his eyes reflecting the brilliant landscape. "Mountain shed its old skin. Sometimes we need to do the same." Standing in that doorway, Mary felt something shift inside her, as if the storm had scoured away not just the landscape, but her old self too. The woman who had arrived, desperate and afraid, seemed like a stranger now. In her place stood someone new, someone who might actually survive. "First lesson," Samuel said, handing Mary a knife with a worn wooden handle. "Everyone up here needs one." The blade gleamed in the morning light streaming through the cabin window, its edge honed to perfection from years of use. Mary Johnson's hands trembled as she accepted the offering. The weight felt foreign against her palm, heavier than the delicate silverware she'd once arranged for dinner parties in Denver, yet somehow more reassuring. This wasn't an ornament, it was survival. "Hold it firmly," Samuel instructed, his voice gentle but firm. "Not like you're afraid of it. The knife respects confidence." He adjusted her grip, his calloused fingers guiding hers with unexpected tenderness. Outside, the snow had begun to recede, revealing patches of earth that had slept beneath winter's blanket. Samuel had risen before dawn, checking his traps and returning with 3 rabbits. Now they hung from a wooden beam. Their still forms a testament to the mountain man's skill. "We'll start with these," he said, gesturing toward the catch. "Food doesn't walk to your table up here." Mary swallowed hard, remembering how she'd once sent servants to market for meat already butchered and cleaned. The widow approached the first rabbit with hesitation, her city upbringing warring with her desperate need to learn. "Like this," Samuel demonstrated, his movements fluid and respectful. "You honor what feeds you by wasting nothing." His hands worked with practiced efficiency, showing her where to cut, how to preserve what was precious. Mary's first attempts were clumsy, her cuts too shallow, her movements uncertain. Frustration burned behind her eyes, but she refused to surrender to tears. Daniel would have mocked her incompetence. Samuel simply nodded and guided her hands again. "Better," he murmured when she finally completed the task. "Your hands remember what your mind is learning." By the 3rd rabbit, Mary's fingers had stopped shaking. There was something primal and honest in the work, a connection to survival that transcended the polite society she'd left behind. Each stroke of the blade built confidence, each completed task a small victory against the wilderness that had once terrified her. "Tomorrow we'll use the skins," Samuel said, washing his hands in a basin of melted snow. "Nothing goes to waste here." As the mountain man prepared a fire to cook their meal, Mary studied the knife in her hand. 6 months ago, she had been a proper lady, concerned with appearances and social standing. Now, she was learning to skin rabbits and survive winter storms. Strangely, she felt more alive than she ever had in her previous life. Each task, no matter how small or gruesome, was a step toward something real, toward claiming this new existence, where she wasn't defined by her husband's debts or society's expectations. "Thank you," she said quietly, cleaning the blade as Samuel had shown her. He looked up from the hearth, surprise flickering across his weathered features. "For what?" "For teaching me to be useful again." The rhythm of the mountain revealed itself to Mary Johnson day by day, like a secret language slowly becoming intelligible. Under Samuel's watchful eye, she learned to preserve venison by smoking it over green wood, hanging strips from the cabin rafters until they turned dark and firm. Her hands, once soft from city life, grew calloused and sure as she worked. "You're getting better," Samuel noted one afternoon, as Mary correctly identified deer tracks in the melting snow. His words were few, but the quiet pride in his voice warmed her more than any elaborate compliment Daniel had ever given. Her former husband had praised her only when others were watching, his admiration as false as his promises. Samuel's approval, by contrast, was honest and earned. The mountain man taught her to read the clouds, to sense the subtle shifts in wind that signaled weather changes. "Skies turning milk white in the west," he explained, pointing toward the horizon. "Snow by morning." Mary found herself nodding, already feeling the truth of it in her bones. At night, when the work was done and the cabin grew quiet except for the crackling fire, Mary would carefully unwrap her mother's recipe book from its protective cloth. The pages were worn thin with use, stained with ingredients from another life. She ran her fingers over her mother's handwriting, feeling a connection to the woman who had taught her that food was love made visible. "What's that?" Samuel asked one evening, his curiosity breaking through his usual reserve. "Apple tart," Mary replied, showing him the faded recipe. "Though we have no apples here." Samuel considered this problem with the same seriousness he gave to tracking game. The next day, he returned with a handful of early spring berries and a small jar of amber honey he'd stored from the previous autumn. "Not apples," he said simply, "but might work." That night, Mary worked by lamplight, adapting her mother's careful instructions to the ingredients of the wilderness. The cabin filled with a sweet aroma as the tart baked in the cast-iron stove. When she finally served the slice to Samuel, The look of surprise and pleasure on his weathered face made her heart swell. "It's different," she admitted, tasting her creation. "The wild berries were tarter than orchard apples, the honey richer than refined sugar. Yet somehow, the essence remained." "Better," Samuel declared, taking another bite. "It belongs here now." Mary understood he wasn't just speaking of the tart. She too was adapting, becoming something new without losing her essence. In the heart of the wilderness, far from society's expectations, she was creating a life that belonged, one that tasted of freedom and possibility. The first green shoots of spring emerged from beneath the melting snow, transforming the mountain landscape into a canvas of renewal. Mary Johnson watched in wonder as Samuel approached the massive brown bear that had wandered near their woodpile. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but she remained still as Samuel had taught her. "Morning, old friend," Samuel called to the creature, his voice neither challenging nor fearful. The bear sniffed the air, acknowledged the mountain man with a tilt of its enormous head, then ambled away toward the thawing creek. "You know him?" Mary asked when Samuel returned to her side, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's Scarface. We've shared these mountains for 8 winters now." Samuel's weathered face creased into a rare smile. "Up here, you learn which creatures demand distance and which ones understand boundaries." Mary marveled at how different this world was from Denver's rigid society. Here, even the wild beasts seemed to follow unwritten codes of respect that made more sense than the arbitrary rules she'd once lived by. As the days lengthened, Samuel guided her deeper into mountain knowledge. He showed her how to read the clouds for coming weather, which plants were emerging as edible, and most importantly, how to track game. His hands, strong yet gentle, adjusted her grip on the hunting rifle, his breath warm against her ear as he whispered instructions. "Breathe with the mountain," he told her. "Feel its rhythm before you take from it." The first deer Mary tracked herself appeared like a vision at dawn, grazing in a meadow dusted with wildflowers. She remembered everything Samuel had taught her: the wind direction, her breathing, the steady pressure of her finger on the trigger. When the shot rang out and the animal fell, she felt no triumph, only a solemn gratitude that Samuel had helped her understand. That evening, as they prepared the venison together, Mary caught her reflection in a pail of water. The woman staring back bore little resemblance to the desperate widow who had stumbled into Samuel's cabin months ago. Her hands were now calloused, her face tanned by mountain sun, her eyes clear and purposeful. "I never thought I could do this," she admitted, working the knife with newfound confidence. "Back in the city, I couldn't even light my own stove without help." Samuel Brown looked up from his work, his dark eyes studying her with quiet appreciation. "The mountain strips away what you think you are and shows you what you truly are," he said simply. "And you, Mary, are stronger than you ever knew." That night, as they sat before the fire, Mary realized she no longer dreamed of returning to civilization. The life she was building with Samuel, hard but honest, wild but true, had become more real than anything she'd known before. The crunch of boots on snow came without warning. Samuel's head snapped up, his hand instinctively reaching for the rifle leaning against the cabin wall. Mary Johnson froze, the basket of early spring herbs dropping from her fingers. 3 men emerged from the tree line, their city clothes marking them as strangers to the mountain. The one in front, a thin man with a waxed mustache and calculating eyes, removed his hat with exaggerated politeness. "Mrs. Johnson, I presume?" His voice carried the practiced smoothness of a lawyer. "Thomas Walker, representing the creditors of your late husband." Samuel moved with deliberate calm, positioning himself between Mary and the visitors. "You're trespassing," he stated, his voice low but carrying the weight of 15 years of mountain solitude. Walker's smile never reached his eyes. "We've been searching for this woman for months. She fled Denver with substantial funds that rightfully belonged to her husband's investors." "That's a lie," Mary whispered, her face draining of color. Daniel left me nothing but debt. Your husband's ledger tells a different story, Walker countered, producing a folded document. $40,000 transferred to an account in your name just before his death. The accusation hung in the thin mountain air. Mary's hands trembled as memories of Daniel's final weeks flashed through her mind. His feverish whispers, papers she'd signed without reading, the strange visits from men she didn't know. I never saw any money, she insisted, her voice finding strength. Check the banks. Check everything. I left with nothing but the clothes on my back. Walker's companions shifted impatiently, hands hovering near their holsters. The courts have issued a warrant. You can return willingly or— She's not going anywhere, Samuel interrupted, his weathered face impassive, but his eyes burning with quiet fury. The standoff stretched until Walker finally replaced his hat. We'll return with the sheriff, he promised, his gaze lingering on the cabin, assessing its worth. This isn't over. After they disappeared into the forest, Mary collapsed onto the rough-hewn bench, the full weight of her situation crashing down. They'll take everything, even this place. Samuel knelt before her, taking her trembling hands in his calloused ones. No one's taking anything, he assured her. The mountain protects its own. That night, as they sat before the fire, Mary finally understood the truth. She wasn't just running from debt. She was fleeing a conspiracy that had claimed her husband's life and now threatened hers. I won't let them make me a fugitive for something I didn't do, she whispered fiercely. Samuel nodded, his arms strong around her shoulders. Then we fight. In that moment, with the wooden cross watching silently from above the mantle, Mary knew she had found something worth fighting for. Not just survival, but a future carved from wilderness and honesty, claimed by choice rather than circumstance. The mountain had transformed her, and now she would defend the life it had given her.